everybody in the brown room the floor put the fuck there are just down the floor in the garden hall on mass on soft enough. This Marquette will go this morning the Lord also the heavens of us or go on kind to a shop on Aculum a court in our law here. Now this is a long cigar, can see a court in our law here, but that's knowing and skill, ancient me out it, me out winter. This mission of order and left shakis issue. So time could you know how God against his fathers. It's a great honor to be up here to introduce this remarkable lady. I don't even know how to begin this introduction because she comes from a remarkable family. A remarkable family that left their own mark on the history of Ireland and the literature of Ireland. Were I to begin to talk about that family, I'd give the lecture, and Micheline and Eddie and everyone could head off for a couple of scopes for themselves. But it's a great pleasure and privilege to introduce Micheline Sheehy Skeffington. She's come out here on the 100th anniversary of her grandmother's trip to the United States. And it was a trip that was motivated by a grave injustice that had been done in Ireland, one of many grave injustices. But when the British took Francis Sheehy Skeffington, a known pacifist, a much admired and loved man, a friend of James Joyce, a friend of Thomas MacDonagh, a man whose name and whose life has left its mark not only in the history of Ireland but in the literature of Ireland. But when they took that man, put him up against the wall and shot him, they didn't realise, you know, that there was also a very formidable figure at his side, his wife, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, feminist, suffragist, and an Irish nationalist, who came from a family of nationalists. My mother would refer to them as rabble rousers. I think Hannah's father was in prison about 6 times. Would that be correct? But a very formidable lady who came to the United States 100 years ago and gave 250 lectures around this country, bringing the case for Ireland to the public, to the court of public opinion here in the United States. John Devoy, who was the president of Clan and Loyal, the largest and most powerful Irish nationalist organisation that ever existed, said that she did more good for the cause of Ireland than all the speakers and all the writers and all the orators that had come out for the previous 25 years. So it's a great honour to be here on this, the 100th anniversary, because one place that Hannah Sheehy Skeffington made sure she came to was to Montana. Because Montana, Butte and Anaconda were seen as one of the 5 great Irish-American cities, the strongholds of Irish America, Irish-American culture and nationalism. And she came here to a rousing and rapturous welcome in Montana. So it's a great honour to have Micheline Sheehy McCormick here. She's a plant ecologist herself, not a historian, and she has also continued the family tradition, getting herself embroiled in all kinds of activities back home in Ireland, dealing with injustices against women. And it's great to have her here. It's great to see her that she's fighting for that cause. And it's great to see that her work, like that of her grandmother before her, is bringing its rewards and benefits for the next generation of young women who are going to come up in Ireland. Micheline, thank you so much for taking the time to come out here. And I'm going to hand over this podium to you now because I've said more than people want to hear, I think. For me to be the man.
Yeah, how do you follow that? But yes, I grew up with Butte, Montana in particular, in the kind of family lore. There was a silver spoon that we use as a sugar spoon, and it had a kind of filigree, and it was Butemont was written on it. And as a child, I just thought, oh, that's somewhere like Buttevant. There's a place in Cork called Buttevant, and didn't really know what it was. It was only really when I came to Butte. It was my first time in Missoula. I came to Butte in 2001, and I suddenly thought, Butte, Montana. And I knew that my grandmother had been to Butte, and that Butte was quite strong, and she had little copper ingots as well from, you know, the mine and all of that. So it was really important for her. She went back there in 1923, and I actually saw her signature in the book that the Sullivan family had, you know, showing that she was important to them. And actually that was the only place that I found resonated with a sort of collective memory. There was nobody there who remembered her or remembered people talking about her, but there was a collective memory of her. Because when I spoke last time in San Francisco or New York, obviously the Irish diaspora had spread out into the ether, but in Butte, Montana, there was a kind of resonance, and here too, and it's great to hear Irish being talked, not just by Trelach, but a lot of you. At least there's a cúpla focal agaí, which is great. Not that I'm a fluent speaker. So I better move on, because I want to talk quite a bit about not just the story of Hannah coming to the US, but obviously the background, who were my grandparents, why did she come to the US, and what was her experiences before that. I'm going to try and get used to that. I thought I'd start with the proclamation. You probably read it many times last year. And there were two bits in it. The Republic guarantees, I should just say again, this is the Easter Rising, you're probably all aware, 1916. Pádraig Pearse reads this out as a kind of constitution at the start of the Rising, declaring a republic. And so this is a kind of small constitution, and it says, the Republic guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights, and equal opportunities to all its citizens. So everybody equal. The word citizen I'll come back to later on. And later on then saying that it's going to establish a permanent national government representative of the whole people of Ireland and elected by the suffrages of all her men and women. Now that's radical, because the women had no vote at that stage, and a lot of the men hadn't. Only men of property over the age of 30 had the vote. So what I'm putting those up there for is because, as Trelach kind of said, my grandparents, Hannah and Francis Sheehy Skeffington, were friendly with James Connolly. They were friendly with Thomas MacDonagh. Pádraig Pearse also supported the suffrage movement and the vote for women. So they had a strong influence on that, even if they didn't sit down and write that proclamation, because they were both pacifists and weren't in the fighting and the competence during the Rising. So I sort of take a little bit of pride in thinking, well, that was the thinking and the momentum of the time that made it that they were going to grant equal suffrage to everyone. And indeed, the permanent national government, Connolly, I gather, and Hannah says, that Hannah would have become one of the ministers in the government. So that also is giving real equality. If at least one of the women would have been a minister. Of course, we know the Rising failed. It didn't happen. They executed a lot of the leaders, and tragedy befell my grandfather and my grandmother as well. So it was for another day. But that's the proclamation as it was written. So who were my grandparents? Well, Hannah Sheehy came from the Sheehy family. On the far left, she was the eldest. She had 5 siblings, and her father, David Sheehy, and Father Eugene Sheehy were both in the Land League. They were Fenians, and as Trelach said, went to prison several times. David at least was 6 times in prison, and Eugene several times as well. So they kind of grew up with that sort of, uncle and father in prison regularly, if you like. And Bessie McCoy, Bessie Sheehy as she became, came from Ballyhahal. The Sheehys were from Broadford in Limerick, both of them, not far. And the McCoys, I learned only recently, the family homestead's still there, and the McCoys are still living in it. And I met Mary McCoy, who's younger than me, and she's an avid family historian and told me a lot about them, including the fact that Bessie herself, as a teenager, defied the local priest because he refused to say prayers for her brothers, who were Fenians and locked up in Kilmainham in Dublin, along with other colleagues. So she said, right, well, I'm going to come back, and she got the keys at the church or whatever, and she led the rosary herself, age 16 or so, to say prayers for the Fenians incarcerated. So rebel spirit on both sides, and indeed Bessie's sister, Kate Barry, as she became, was in the Ladies' Land League, and as you may know, the Ladies' Land League ran the Land League better, if anything, than the men. So it was, when the men were all in prison, then the women took over and ran it for them and ran it for themselves as well. And Kate Barry took Hannah, aged about 4, to Dublin, because the Sheehy family were living in Lochmore at that stage. Hannah was born in County Cork, but the rest were born in Lochmore, in Tipperary. She took Hannah up to Dublin to visit her uncle Eugene in Kilmainham prison. So she had an early education. In fact, she said, your education is not complete until you've been to prison. So there's a mark of objective. So she came from a long line of troublemakers. Also, this idea that the Land League and the injustices of what was happening at the time, David and Eugene, and indeed Bessie, they grew up through the worst times of the hunger. They were born in the early 1840s. And so they saw the after effects of the hunger, they saw the poverty, they saw the evictions, you know, all of that was happening. So there was quite a strong influence on the children, if you like, the family discussions. And Hannah, in her own writings, and I should have it here, I have a biography which has just come out, not a biography, but Hannah's memoirs, as far as they have gone, and her published letters have just been published in Ireland by Margaret Ward, UCD Press. And in there, she says as children they used to play at evictions. And none of them wanted to play the role of the bailiffs, of course. They just wanted to be the poor families. So very early on, very interested in politics and aware of things. So this is a stitchwork piece done by the 8-year-old Hannah Sheehy, and it's entitled My Land League Hut. And the Land League were getting temporary dwellings for people who were thrown out on the side of the road, and obviously she had great ambitions for people to house them in some hut, a 3-story building with lovely big windows and rooms. And I think that's interesting that the 8-year-old was keen to do that and establish something and play a role basically in Ireland, and very aware that independence would be part of that, to throw off the shackles of the landlords and British rule as part of that. Francis Skeffington was born in Cavan, as Trellock said, Baileyborough, but moved very soon. His parents moved back to Downpatrick, and he grew up in Downpatrick in County Down. And he had a very different background because he was an only child, and his father was educated. I should say, by the way, that I have a camera person with me. We're also filming for the television, I gather, here. But Eddie Ballark is here filming because I'm trying to do a documentary following in my grandmother's footsteps. And Montana was one of the key places I wanted to film and get something about. We just crowdfunded to get a small film crew, who's now gone down from 2 to 1, to come at key places, and we've just been in Chicago, so that's why I have a camera crew and I'm recording it as well. So Frank's father was a schools inspector, and it shows how much he thought of the schools, because he educated his son entirely at home. Both junior and high school, he was educated at home. And Frank actually said his father was a very good educator, and Frank was very widely read. I don't know how he got hold of all the books and things, but one of the things he says in one of his writings is that he, aged 11, became interested in feminism, reading a piece by W.T. Stead about Gladstone, and Stead said, you know, both apparently Skeffington and Stead valued what Gladstone did, but Gladstone did nothing for women. And the 11-year-old thinks, oh yes, we must do something for women. So at age 11, he starts to be aware that women are disadvantaged and not getting an equal treatment. So quite unusual, to say the least. He was a militant pacifist, in fact, and Stead, I think, would have been one of his influencing writers. And I say militant, people tend to confuse being pacifist and being passive. And he was anything but, and he was not afraid to put his own life in danger for his causes, for his principles. The only thing he said is that I'm not prepared to kill anybody for it. So that's why he's called militant pacifist, and I'll explain a little bit more later on. So ardent feminist, militant pacifist, very keen nationalist, socialist. Both Hannah and Frank were socialists. They believed in equal rights and equality for everybody, not just the powers that be, but workers' rights basically, and involved in the lockout in 1913. But he was also a vegetarian and a teetotaler and an anti-vivisectionist, and people liked him a lot and valued him, but they used to just call him a crank. You know, you're doing nothing but a crank. And he said, yeah, a crank is a small instrument that causes revolutions. So he was imperturbable, and I think some of that has to do with the fact he wasn't at school, so he wasn't self-conscious the way we are. It's when we're at school, we want to fit in with everybody. He didn't have that. He missed it, actually, but he wasn't so, he didn't care what people thought of him. He didn't care what people thought of his dress. That was less unconventional then. People wore +4s, knickerbockers in those days, but he didn't care. It was a matter of principle, in fact. He turned down a small job in the university later on, because he would have had to wear a formal frock coat. And he wrote back and said, as you know, it's a matter of principle, I don't wear formal dress. So that's his clothes and how he gets about. It's quite an interesting kind of political discussion there going on with William O'Brien, who was to found the ITGW, the trade union, Transport Workers and General Union. So socialist discussion probably going on. So Frank and Hannah went to the Royal University, as it was called then, but they were not. The women did not attend lectures with the men. God forbid that they would distract each other from their lectures, so the women were in a different building, the men were in Newman House and Stephen's Green, and the women were in Marion Row. And the first piece that Frank wrote, kind of that got published in a pamphlet, was with a certain other, James A. Joyce. And both of them had been refused publication in the student magazine St. Stephen's. And they were friends, they knew each other in college and that, and they said, well, what are we going to do about this? We want to get our pieces out somewhere. So they clubbed together and they published it, priced 2p with the publishers, also Stephen's Green, so not far. The Joyce's one is quite a pompous one about the rabble, you know, affecting the arts and that. But Frank's one, of course, is about equality for women. And he says, a forgotten aspect of the university question, they were debating the university's acts, which was to be passed in 1908, establishing the National University. And he's saying women are not equal, they're not attending lectures, but more to the point, they're not allowed to attend any of the societies. Imagine going to university and being debarred from the societies. I mean, that's the best part of a university, isn't it? And particularly the debating society. So Skeffington and Joyce and Tom Kettle, who was a barrister and married Hannah's sister, Mary Sheehy, and a whole load of them were very strong and had great lively debates, and the women couldn't even come, let alone participate. So he's saying this is not right, and the women are getting at least as many honours degrees, and yet they're not getting equality there. So that's, and I will say at the very end, mention as Trelach alluded to, that I won a case against my university because that aspect of the university question is still somewhat forgotten. I think it's kind of interesting that it was the first publication of my grandfather, and I'm still battling on behalf of women. So in 1903, they used to meet not obviously at lectures, but they had the National Library was their library, so they used to meet in and around there, and also in all kinds of gatherings, and particularly the Sheehy home, where Hannah had obviously several siblings. Her brothers went to school with James Joyce, so he was friendly with the family, and Skeffington, Kettle, all of them, and they'd play at charades. Joyce used to play the piano and sing. Pity he can't sing today. I don't know if Trelach's going to sing for us later. Hannah, by the way, when she came here, there was always a recital and a song, and you know, there was not just a speech, so I do expect it. It's from somebody later on. So they met there, and eventually, obviously, they decided to get married, and they got married in 1903, and what's unusual is that they each took each other's name. So Frances Skeffington became Frances Sheehy Skeffington, and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington. And the Skeffington family was a little bit put out, diluting the good Skeffington name, but the Sheehys seemed to weather that. It's unusual. Not many men. There was one man, I don't know if I put up your hands, any men who've taken their wives' name. There was one man in Chicago yesterday, at a meeting in Chicago, I should add, that had, but it's not usual even now, so that's groundbreaking, if you like. But that name is a feminist statement in itself. Now, the other thing is that this has been said, and is in some ways their wedding photograph, which is kind of a bit odd. I'm just going to get some water. And basically what it is in those days they got married in the university church in Stephen's Green, and they would have gone to a studio possibly weeks later. It wouldn't have happened on the day, quite likely. And in those days, the women had only been allowed access to universities for about 20 years, so they were very proud of the fact they did have degrees, and to show that they were equal and equally capable as the men. So they had calling cards, you know, the equivalent of a kind of selfie today. They had these cards printed, and they would sign them and send them, you know, as kind of postcards. And often they had themselves dressed in their gowns. These are MA gowns, which they probably rented by the hour. There's no way they owned those. And I reckon that Frank is wearing his we're equal in this. We both got MAs, we're equal. So though the women mostly had the photos taken, here's the two of them together. And you'll also notice that the formal photograph still has Frank in his baggy tweed suit, and he probably got married in the baggy tweed suit. So I don't have a problem with that. I don't much care for formal things either. But that's why it's the wedding photograph, if you like. It's their first formal photo after they were married. So I suppose this is all a background because, you know, there's a lot of activism going on, and one of the key things that they focused on, and indeed there was a focus as well as the emerging struggle for independence, was the right to vote. And that was happening here as well, that women hadn't got the vote over here, they hadn't got the vote in Britain. And they'd first joined the Irish Women's Suffrage and Local Government Association, but it was fairly slow moving and was petitioning the Irish Party, for example. And Hannah's father was an MP for the Irish Party, and yet didn't have much to do with Hannah's activities. And the Irish Party felt that the women's vote was muddying the waters. We want to get home rule, is what the Irish Party with Redmond and those were going for, and they weren't that keen on pushing forward the vote. So the women, these are young women, they're 20-something-year-olds. This is actually an older photo. That's Hannah on the left and Meg Connery on the right. But in 1908, they're, you know, in their early 20s, impatient to do something more proactive. And Hannah and Margaret Cousins founded the Irish Women's Franchise League, which is what that is there. And that's the banner. I grew up with that banner. It was just fired in the corner in the press, you know, God, that's the banner. You know, and it's actually a fabulous piece of work. That's the whole thing here. Now, you girl goers can read that out. Cumanachty Gore, Cochram and Lamon. So on one side it's in Irish, on the other side in English. So that's first of all establishing, you know, that we have two languages, very much a part of the Gaelic revival. Obviously the decorations also part of that, and it's done by the Duneamer Guild, which was founded by the Yates sisters, William Butler and Jack B. Yates' sisters. So they were the craftspeople, and it's hand done. There's rows and rows of hand stitches doing that. But the other thing is the colours. The WSPU was the British Women's Social Political Union, the Pankhursts, and that. Their colours were green and purple, and it was slightly darker green than that. This is a Republican statement. This is the Irish Franchise League, green and orange, were the Irish colours. And that's one of the reasons why I think today people often, even in Ireland, say, oh, I'm wearing the suffrage colours, and they're wearing green and purple. And I say, no, the Irish colours were green and orange. But of course, they're the Irish colours as well, so people forget they were one and the other. But in those days, that was a strong statement because Ireland was not independent. So the Franchise League is saying, yes, we're following what they're doing in Britain, but we're doing our own thing here and we're independent. And actually, I'm wearing a replica badge, which is the Irish Women's Franchise League, and that's also in green and orange. So there's the English one as well in their colours. So this is the statement, if you like, as part of that revival, if you like, of energy. So what they did was they had speeches in town. In those days, everybody had, you know, people came together in town, in Phoenix Park or wherever. People didn't really have halls, and you've seen pictures, the big mass crowds was the way to do it. So the women had these fold-up platforms, and again, I grew up with one particular quite large one with votes for women on a plaque, and a brass plaque on it. And they would just set it up and they'd start talking about the vote for women, and well ably doing it too. So the women were pleading their own cause, and obviously demonstrating that they were well capable of doing that. And they took heckling and they took things being thrown at them, but they just carried on doing that. They also disrupted meetings. If there was any formal meetings, they'd maybe break in and start heckling and shouting. Just ways of kind of drawing attention to what they're doing. But things are still slow moving, and they're mindful of what was going on already in Britain. And they decided that they would do some pro-action, and they said, let's smash some windows and get ourselves noticed, because that's what you want, is to get covered in the press. And believe you me, with the campaign that I've been involved in since 2014 when I won my case, getting covered in the press is all what you want. It's high publicity, and smashing windows kind of does do it for you. They got themselves arrested, but Hannah said, I'm going to smash windows in Dublin Castle, because that's the seat of British power, so I'm going to have a go at the British while I'm at it. So I grew up, my father told me, I never knew Hannah, she died before I was born, but he told me, you know, you're left-handed like your grandmother, and she was proud of the fact, because when she went to smash the windows, the police came out quite fast, being Dublin Castle, and automatically immobilised her right hand, and she was left-handed, and she could get another go at the windows. And as a kid, you're kind of going, yeah, whatever, you know, I'm 8 or something. And then later you think, not everyone's told to be proud of their granny who was arrested for smashing windows. You know, it's kind of, but that's the kind of legacy you grow up with, and it takes a while to distill the whole thing. So there's about 8 or 9 of them that are tried and sentenced in 2 different cohorts, and this is in the spring and summer of 1912. And they're in prison, and during that time Prime Minister Asquith came over from England, and there were 2 English suffragettes came over, and they threw a mock hatchet at his carriage, and they got arrested, thrown into Mountjoy jail. So now there's 2 English suffragettes along with the Irish suffragettes in the cells. And what happens then is the 2 English suffragettes go on hunger strike. And the Irish women are just getting used to prison food, let alone giving up prison food. And they're thinking, God, what do we do? We haven't thought about this. They had been going on hunger strike in Britain for a while, and that was what they did. And so what do we do? Do we show solidarity? We haven't really thought about it. And in the end, they realized that Hannah and her cohort had only about 5 days left to serve. And so they said, right, well, we're going to do it in solidarity. So she did it for the 5 days, and she's written again in her memoirs, she said, I didn't know that tea had a smell. You know, that's all she's taking is tea or water or whatever. And she said the one thing, though, she dreaded was if there was she heard a group of people coming down the corridor. You're in the cell, you don't see out, you don't know what's happening, and maybe 4 or 5 people, footsteps coming down the corridor. She was in dread that they were going to come and force feed her, because that's what they were doing in Britain. And, you know, a way to stop them getting ill and dying was to force food down their throats, and really dangerous because they weren't doing it in a particularly good way. And actually, when I was in Buffalo, I stayed with a medical friend who said that his hospital works for the local prison, and sometimes there are prisoners who refuse food, and they're referred to the hospital, and the hospital refuses, said, no, we don't force feed. It's tantamount to torture. So they don't go into what the prisoner is doing it for or why. They just said, no, we don't force food on someone who's refusing food. So that's ongoing, and it's something that's torture. The hospital recognizes that, medical people do. So she was in dread of that, but actually what happened after the 5 days, they released them without force feeding them, but they force fed the English women as soon as they released the Irish. And that was interesting. And they weren't to know that, but they never force-fed Irish suffragettes on Irish soil. They obviously realized that was just a step too far, you know, to do that. They did force-feed a few that were on hunger strike in Britain. They force-fed British suffragettes hunger striking wherever. And this is a picture of Hannah then coming out of prison, obviously looking a bit weak and thin. She's had 5 days without food. There's Frank to the right, and that's her Uncle Eugene there to greet her once she came out of Mountjoy. I don't know who the man is at the back, but there's not a sign of her father. Wouldn't really be there. He didn't really approve, he didn't say anything, but he wasn't there. So that's her kind of proud of her hunger striking, if you like. It was the first time she'd done it. At the same time, Frank is a journalist, and he's getting a bit frustrated at getting publicity, and so he and James Cousins found the suffrage newspaper, The Irish Citizen, in 1912, around the same time, to cover all these activities. And the first thing to point out is the title of the paper. This is Ireland in 1912. Is there something unusual about The Irish Citizen as a name? We're used to it all. I'm citizen, you're citizens. They were subjects. They were not citizens. That's a statement in itself, a not very subtle one. That say the British realize they're not citizens. Remember, in the proclamation, they're declaring a republic with their citizens. And so this is a kind of same theme. So quietly saying, or not that quiet, because Frank was never quiet, you know, another statement of independence, if you like. The picture is of United. It was a big meeting. I won't go into it. I haven't researched it myself much. United Irish Women. But there's a few things to point out. One is that's that photo of Hannah there that you saw, minus Frank. And then there's Margaret Cousins also in her graduation gown. So you can see it was the kind of thing, if you had a degree, you kind of flaunted it, if you like. And the United, it says nationalist and unionist, which is interesting. So people from Belfast, there was a woman from Belfast, a woman from London, Limerick, all around, nationalists and unionists, militant and non-militant. So in other words, we're fighting for the vote for women. We might have different methods and other viewpoints behind it all, but we all want the vote. And I think that's quite important, because we tend to compartmentalize people even today and say, oh yeah, well, they're just unionists and they're, militant people. But actually everybody came together when they had the one common cause, which in this case was the vote for women. But the other thing is the banner headline at the top is pure Frank, I'm certain. For men and women equally, the rights of citizenship. That's what they're looking for, and for all to be equal, to have the right to vote. And we campaign even now for equal rights for different things. That's an important fundamental thing. But he says from men and women equally, the duties of citizenship. And that we sometimes forget, that we have a duty, we have a right. If I can exercise that right, I have a duty to do right by my fellow human beings. And that was something Frank really felt very strongly about. And as a pacifist, he's trying to tease out dialogues between people with differences, but to do a duty by them, and also being socialist, trying to support the workers. He was in the Irish Citizen Army when it was founded, because it was to protect the workers from the police brutality. They were shooting them in the street. So a duty to do something. And that came through to my father, who always saw it as a duty to speak out against hypocrisy, to fight for, like he tried to get corporal punishment abolished in schools, and was very unpopular at the time, but he spoke out and was able to do it. So I think that sort of sense of duty must have come through, and that's partly why I took my case, because I felt I ought to, that my grandparents were there saying you must do this and you have a duty if you see wrong, and you can do it, and you're not afraid to stand up and say something. And I had an ability in my situation to do it, not just whether if I could do it or not. So that duty of citizenship, I think, is an important one to remember. Probably, no more now than any other time, about human rights and differences in that way, both here and globally. So there's another piece of action here. I think this is a nice piece of photojournalism. This is 1913. That's Meg Connery. She's got the Irish Citizen here. And questions for Bonar Law. And Bonar Law is the man she's handing the leaflets to, and he's the head of the Conservative Party in Britain. And he's come over, he's posing on the steps of Ivy House in Stephen's Green, and you might recognise this man here, looks as stubborn and uncompromising as you can get, totally oblivious of what's going on. That's Edward Carson, who's come from Northern Ireland, presumably for the meeting. So she's handing, if Bonar Law looks like he's about to take it, he looks mildly amused. Policeman's going to take her away fairly rapidly. So a great piece of action. But what Hannah told my mother is that the man in the distance, and maybe a couple of others, are looking into the middle distance. And she says that's because she was in the crowd. So they're on the steps and there's a crowd in Stephen's Green listening or watching what's going on. And she's there. She probably had another placard as well. And a policeman spotted her and arrested her immediately. And she was raging. She says, the next time I get arrested, I won't have deserved it. Because she didn't get a chance to do anything. He just took her. He actually charged her with assault, and in court everybody kind of started giggling because he was about 6'3" and she was not much taller than me. So the idea that she'd really hurt him, by assaulting him was ludicrous. He just spotted her and took her in. So Meg Connery and Hannah are thrown into prison, well, charged and sentenced, put into prison, and they both go on hunger strike. Again, so they were doing this regularly. And at that stage, they'd brought in an act in Britain called the Temporary Release Due to Ill Health Act. Very clever to diffuse the whole hunger strike thing. If you're not very well, which you wouldn't be if you've refused food for a long time, you could be released. But if you were showing signs of doing any other misdemeanors, smashing windows or whatever, you could be taken and thrown in prison without charge and without sentence, which are two key fundamental rights. And so it's like a cat playing with a mouse. It was known as the Cat and Mouse Act, releasing you and then grabbing you in again. So there was great protests against the Cat and Mouse Act. So Meg Connery and Hannah on hunger strike were released within a few days, 3 or 4 days, under the Cat and Mouse Act. But of course then they were not able to do so much direct action because they would have been thrown in prison again. So 1913, next year is 1914, in the outbreak of World War I. Frank the pacifist brings out this big poster, Irish Citizen, votes for women. Now, damn your war. So it's quite clear where he stands. He's pacifist. He sees the First World War as a waste of human life. This is fighting. But he's also saying, this is not our war. This is Britain's war. And the suffragettes in Britain downed tools and said, well, let's do something, contribute to the war effort. The Irish suffragettes said, not our war, we carry on business as usual. So there was differences there as well. But he proceeds to campaign against recruitment in Ireland. He says, it's not our war, it's senseless, I don't want any of this to happen. So he makes these speeches, over 40 speeches again on soapboxes and in and around town. In the end, the British said, no, we've had enough, this is seditious talk, arrested him and tried him in court. And this is a great piece. These are all in the family archives, obviously an old press cutting. And he defends himself. He saw it as an opportunity again to tell everybody why he was making his speeches. And he gets seditious speech, just one in Beresford Place, but one of 40. Mr. Sheehy Skeffington gets 6 months, and he got hard labour. So much more severe. I suppose it was a more severe on their side activity. And he says, I'll be soon out of prison, dead or alive. I'm not serving this 6 months. I'll be out long before that. Dead or alive, I'm going on hunger strike. So you can imagine, Hannah and Frank had a son. Owen was born in 1909, and his parents are in and out of prison all the time. I'll come back to that again. But there's Frank now in prison on hunger strike. But within days, he goes on thirst strike. And that's really deadly. Like, you don't survive long if you're refusing fluids as well. And obviously the British thought, this man is well known, he's well liked about Ireland, he's in prison in Mountjoy jail, and they released him under the Cat and Mouse Act because, you know, they weren't going to allow him to die. It would have caused too much sensation. So again, he felt he couldn't do much, and he came to the United States. He was here in 1915, and I'm picking up tidbits about where he was. I saw a letter from J. Sheehy, who didn't seem to be a relative, from Chicago, condolences after he was shot. I saw him only a few months ago in Chicago. There's a letter from Jane Addams to him in Long Island, and so on. So he was all around talking to Irish nationalists and people like John Devoy and those feminists, socialists, all kinds of groups, and thoroughly enjoyed it, and discovered the telephone and said, this is a wonderful invention, I'm going to have one when I come home, because obviously it's all about communication. So he used to say in the States, I'm on holiday under the Cat and Mouse Act, because, you know, it's enabled him to come over. Before he was sentenced, obviously, but a little bit early on in 1915, he wrote this open letter to Thomas MacDonagh, as you know, one of the signatories of the proclamation, but also an old friend of his, MacDonagh, and he taught in St. Kieran's College in Kilkenny before they moved up to Dublin again. Or well, MacDonagh was from Cloughjordan in Tipperary. And MacDonagh had spoken several times at an Irish Women's Franchise League meeting, and Skeffington starts off by saying, I didn't join the volunteers. Now he's talking about the volunteers which were formed relatively recently. He said, I didn't join them on feminist grounds because you don't allow women into the volunteers. And Hannah didn't join Common na Mon because Common na Mon was seen as subservient to the volunteers, who were the decision-making body. So neither joined either for feminist reasons. And he says, I'm glad I didn't now, because it sounds like you're talking really militaristically and arming up with weapons and all that, and I don't like the sound of that at all. And he ends by saying, can you not conceive of a body of people grouped together with one common cause and one single objective, but which does not have as a fundamental tenet, I will kill my fellow human beings for my objectives. So he, every bit as much as, you know, the leaders, the volunteers, and eventually the leaders of the Rising, he wanted independence. He just couldn't kill for that objective. He was prepared to die, as he did, you know, could have for his principles, but not to kill. So I think it's interesting to say that, because obviously his campaigns were not anti-British, they were also anti-war and anti-fighting, anti-killing. That was his principle, if you like. So 1916, you may know the story, it's hard to shorten it down. Frank and Hannah were told by Connolly, who was friends with them, to stay around during Easter week, and when the rising broke out, they each went into town. Hannah actually went into the GPO to see could she help around ferrying messages and food and all of that. And Frank sees that there's a lot of looting going on in town. And it's interesting because he's not interested in property. He was never, you know, he wasn't keen on that. But he saw this as creating a bad image, that the British press were bound to cover this as just a bunch of rabble-rousers just looting and raiding, and, you know, that's typical of the Irish, you know, the reputation, you're just a bunch of ruffians. And he said, this is not good for the rising. So he really wanted the rising to be successful. So he's quite conflicted. And my father's even said this, there's a tape on the radio saying that, conflicted during the rising because he wanted them to succeed, but he couldn't condone the killing. So he says, right, I'll go into, he went into the GPO himself and says to Connolly and the people there, he says, are you doing anything about this? This is terrible, all this looting. And they said, yes, we are concerned about it. It does give us a bad image, and we've tried to stop it by firing volleys over their heads and that, but they're not stopping. And, you know, we're kind of busy here in the GPO, the rising. Can you do something about it? So Frank goes off out and tries to recruit people to try and stop the looting. So he's in town on Monday. He goes in again on Tuesday trying to get people, pretty well in vain, because if people weren't fighting, they were not very keen to be in and around town where there's lots of shooting and sniping. And he's walking home over Portobello Bridge into Rathmines where he lived, and of course there's Portobello Barracks, and there's a British Army patrol out. They're in disarray too, not knowing where they're being shot at and what's, you know, there's snipers even on the Portobello Bridge, and he's taken in. Captain Bowen Coulter recognised him and took him into Portobello Barracks and continued on doing raids and arresting people. And then he took Frank out of the cell where he was held. That evening there was a curfew, and they were taking him out without permission. Coulters took him out of his cell as a kind of hostage, because if they're patrolling around, he reckoned that Frank would be a kind of guard, a human shield, if you like, in that they wouldn't dare snipe at the British soldiers, because the implication was that Skeffington would be shot. And so he's there kind of as a hostage with his hands tied behind his back. And they meet two teenage boys coming from church in Rathmines and challenge them. And whatever J.J. Code, one of them did, might have turned round a bit suddenly, you know, teenagers. You know, I don't know what happened, but he ordered one of his soldiers to bat him. And the soldier, with the butt of his rifle, hit him and apparently smashed his jaw. And he fell to the ground, obviously. And Coulters pulls out a pistol and shoots him dead. Now that's murder. And there's Frank, the pacifist, you know, witnessing this, and he starts, you know, he says, that's outrageous, you can't do that, that's murder, that's impossible. Makes quite a strong speech, which apparently one of the soldiers who was witness to the whole thing reported back and said he was amazingly eloquent and brave in what he said, you know, because he's a hostage, he's in, you know. And Coulters more or less did say, you shut up, mate, you know, you have to be quiet or you'll be next. And Coulters sat up all night studying the Bible, found a passage which suited what he wanted to do, which is take forth thine enemies and slay them. And he realized, you see, that Frank had witnessed something that Coulters knew was murder. Frank is a journalist, he's an outspoken pacifist, he had to be got rid of. So he took him out again from his cell without permission, and without permission obviously, had him shot by firing squad the next day. So this is Wednesday of the Easter week. Now what also happened was he took two other journalists, Thomas Dixon and Patrick McIntyre, and took them out and shot them as well, presumably because they were journalists. So this man was later sentenced guilty but insane. And Hannah, my grandmother, always said he's not insane. You can see here widow points for necessity of full public inquiry because the trial was a bit of a travesty, and she says he wasn't insane. A man who can say, right, well, what I did obviously was wrong. This man has witnessed us. He's a journalist. He's outspoken. I have to get rid of him. There's two other journalists. I'm going to get rid of them too because they'll witness me shooting and that. That's premeditated and quite, you know, reasoning. Obviously, he's acting completely out of order and out of control himself, but not totally insane. What it did mean, though, is he was sent to Broadmoor in England, and he only served 2 years and ended up going to Vancouver in Canada. And I'll be in Vancouver. I'm not sure what I'm going to find there, but he lived out his life there for the rest of the time. And meanwhile, Hannah's lost her husband, Frank, and she's calling for a full inquiry. One of the 2 days after Frank was shot, there's a raiding party, breaks all the windows in the house where Hannah and Owen are. Hannah doesn't even really know what's happened to Frank at this stage. And the soldiers come in with bayonets and that and hold them at gunpoint, raid Frank's office, and tear all Owen's drawings and things off the walls and take them away. And this is one of the few that was returned. And this is proof that they were German sympathizers. This is the 5 or 6 year old's drawings of German Zeppelins, the 5 or 6 year old's impression of a German flag and battleships. And it says, I certify that this was found in Skeffington's house, J.C. Bowen Coulthurst, 28th of April, 1916. Well, he was shot on the 26th, so that's how he stooped to try and get proof and evidence. And it's being German sympathizer would be a treasonable act, but I don't think a child's drawing would be exactly evidence of that. I thought I'd put this in because I'm finding stuff as I go along, and I took the train, the night train from Buffalo to Chicago, sit opposite a man at breakfast, and he's researching the New York Times for researching Victor Herbert, and he sent me about 30 different press cuttings, and this is one of them, the New York Times, and it's an article, the New York Times is reporting it in the Dublin Clarion. And the heading's a bit odd, charges blunders to army in Dublin, and it's Major Sir Francis Vane, who was a senior officer there but had not been around when Coulthurst did all these acts and indeed went on to murder some more. Richard O'Carroll was shot later on that day. And he then gives an account of it, and that's reported in the New York Times in August during the Simon inquiry, which happened afterwards. And I think that's interesting that it does come as far as the States reporting what it is. And it's just briefly Sir Francis Vane went to Kitchener, and he said on Monday basically the rebellion ceased. I was naturally relieved from my active duties. A curious part of this transaction, curious is an odd word in itself, however, was that I was ordered to hand over my duties to Captain Coulthurst. So this Major Sir Francis Vane, who had tried to get Coulthurst arrested, is demoted, and Coulthurst is promoted, and that's the account of it. So it took days before Coulthurst was actually taken in and tried, and this is reported here in the New York Times in 1916, so people are very keen to read that kind of thing, and it comes right through to here. And he says, who 6 days before had illegally executed 3 men, as I well knew. Kitchener was horrified by this, and yet his orders to have him arrested were ignored, in fact, for another few days. The British, and I think that's one of the worst things, is the cover-up. It's one thing having an insane man or a man acting completely out of order. It's another thing to say, actually, it was a good thing Skeffington was got rid of, and you know what, we can't have a full investigation because this is wartime, and we'll promote the man who did the shootings. So that's collusion at the highest level, and that's worse almost than the crimes of that Coulthurst himself. I'll just have a little interlude, bring you back up to the 21st century. In the yard, which is the guardroom yard at the back where Skeffington was held, this is the yard where he was shot. They had, the Department of Defence had a ceremony to commemorate the 3 men, Skeffington, Dixon and McIntyre. Actually, Dixon's family were there. They're from Glasgow. It was very nice to meet them. I didn't know anything about them. And I read out, of course, the piece of some of the bit of the open letter to Thomas MacDonagh. So it was kind of interesting to read this very strong pacifist words in a barracks, in the place he was shot by British Army, surrounded by Irish Army. But the other nice thing was that Michael D. Higgins, our president, was actually in the barracks that afternoon opening the military archives, and he agreed to come and lay white roses at the wreaths for Frank. And the white roses were to represent the pacifism, and the thorns, the kind of pacifism that Frank was, very thorny pacifist that he was. So that was great that Michael D. and Sabina Higgins came and laid roses at the wreaths. And you can see God was on our side that day, and there's Ray coming down. And it was also quite moving to see that the army officers that were there were quite moved by the whole ceremony, and they too took white roses and laid them. So it was kind of nice to involve the army in something quite strong and powerful, I think, in that place. So that's commemorations have changed a little bit since 1966, and it's widening out and including people like Frank, who would not have been combatants, or he was remembered in 66, but it's a more formal recognition, I think, in last year for lots of reasons. But the full public inquiry was not satisfactory, and Hannah had gone to Asquith in London and said, I want this inquiry. He'd said, no, it's not possible really to have everything investigated. It's wartime. I'll give you £10,000, as compensation. And she said, I'm not interested in money. She said, and that's the equivalent of about $1 million today. And she didn't even hear it. She said, I want the truth. And the full truth. And he said it's not possible, and she wasn't happy with the outcome of that inquiry. Vane, Sir Francis Vane himself wasn't even there. Coulter's wasn't there. It wasn't, the truth obviously didn't come out. Again, suppression of the truth. She said, right, I'm going to go to the States and I'm going to tell the truth. So how does she do this? The British say, well, you can't have a passport unless you promise not to talk about Ireland, England or Britain and the war. So that wasn't going to happen. So she gives the British the slip. She disguises herself. She's got her young son Owen with her, who's 7, and they go up to Glasgow, possibly because that was a smaller port. And the Skinner family, who you may all know of, Margaret Skinner, fought in the Rising, they were in Glasgow, from Glasgow, and they arranged that she would get a false name and a false passport. So that's a passport photograph, which is in the archives, and on the back, a parish priest has said, I swear by Almighty God that this is Mrs. Mary Gribben. So minor perjury in the And there's Master Eugene Gribben. And what was great was that we were in Ellis Island, where they keep the records of the ship's manifest, and they've digitized the original one. So you've got the handwriting of the ship's purser, and there you see Mrs. Mary Gribben and, British, Scottish, from Glasgow and so on, and then Master Eugene Gribben. And it also said that she was going to be met by Margaret Skinner, which was something I hadn't really seen, and was unusual to do that. But she sailed, therefore, from Glasgow on the Cameronia in December 1916. And this is why I'm here, really, because what she did was really quite incredible. She's newly widowed. She's no money. She's left her job certainly without telling them where she was going, because she's in disguise. She's got a 7-year-old son with her, and it's December, and the seas are really rough, and Owen was sick for most of the journey, really a rough time. And the seas are full of submarines. They'd sunk the Lusitania in 1915. The Laconia was sunk not long afterwards, as a headline which refers to Hannah, and it just says it was sunk. So that was pretty brave. She also didn't know when she got to New York what was going to happen. Was she going to be turned away? Because the British would have had her arrested. But in fact, in the States, they said, well, she's not a criminal. And they let her through and admitted her into New York. So I just thought I'd put this up. It's a press cutting. It's stamped the Evening Sun. There were press cuttings in the family things. And it just said, Skeffington's widow here despite British pursuit, broken in health. She must not be, she must not be visited, and that. I think that's a little bit of a smoke screen. I think she was still, this December the 19th, she arrived virtually that day and had press conferences soon after that. I think she was not a bit wary about whether she would be arrested, but notice she's called Mrs. F, and I don't think she called herself that, but Mrs. F, Sheehy Skeffington, is in the Hotel Earl in Waverley Place. I just highlight that because that hotel is still there. It's the Washington Square Hotel now. So she comes over, she's now Mrs. Sheehy Skeffington again. She's wondering what to do. There are a number of people that met her. I just realized that she wrote that Emma Goldman, who was in Chicago, the Industrial Workers of the World, anarchist, socialist, feminist, met her in December and was also at the her first big meeting, which was in Carnegie Hall. So she does several press conferences. She's posing there with Owen. Notice someone has decked him out, Owen in particular, in this tweed suit. Someone says he's wearing a kilt. Actually, there's a description where he's wearing a kilt. Now again, that's the Irish community. The Irish American community welcomed them and must have paid for that hotel and must have paid, obviously, for Owen's clothes. I say he never saw clothes like that before. So there's a real support that she's sensing there, and people coming to visit her and friends and that. And then when she goes to Carnegie Hall, it's absolutely full. And that she must have realized, that she's launched And we actually stood, we couldn't film there because it costs money, there's union rules, but we could go privately and just, without filming, just stand on the stage and to see the whole of Carnegie Hall. Imagine what that must have been like, coming out and it full of all kinds of supporters, different people from all walks of life. And a lot of them were probably friends and people who met Frank when he was over in 1915. So that's the kind of handbill which I found in the papers, which says it's a memorial to Frank F. Sheehy Skeffington. And people like Mrs. Porrick Collum and Porrick Collum, the top and bottom of that thing, they were in college with Hannah and Frank, so they're friends. John F. Byrne. But it's a wide range of Irish American and other communities. There's no Friends of Irish Freedom or Clonlang Ale or any of them. It's just a whole load of friendship, if you like. And I think that's interesting as a starting point. Then John Devoy takes over a little bit. The Friends of Irish Freedom starts to support. And as Trailock said, 3 months later, and not even in March 1917, he says she's done more real good for the cause of Ireland than all the previous orators of the last 25 years. And in that article, he says she must be received in all the towns around New England, and he lists off some of them. And she did. She went to Lowell, Lawrence in Massachusetts, Holyoke, and I think it's in Massachusetts as well, and all around New Hampshire, upstate New York, and all of that. So she toured all around and was hosted, and real sensation. She was in Chicago by February and again spoke in the orchestra hall, and she's at this stage well launched. This is an interesting account, and I just thought I'd throw this in because it comes back to the beginning. She's proud of her father, David Sheehy, was in the Fenian uprising. It refers then to Owen later on. He was member of the House of Commons for Meath, imprisoned 6 times, and was in jail with Parnell, as was my uncle Eugene. So there she's kind of proud of this, you know, long line. I was jailed twice for the suffrage cause. So you see, my 7-year-old son Owen, who was with me in America, has seen something of family jail life. So she's making a bit of a joke about it, and just how much. And then there's some interviews with Owen as well, and that's the picture. Obviously, people are making a story about the 7-year-old as well. So that's reported over here, obviously, you know, widely. Lots of reports. Various press cuttings just to show she was in Indianapolis, she was in Chicago, she was then came to Butte, Montana, a little bit later on, and right through North New York, and then on to Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and back over again through different, she was in Texas, she was in Kentucky, she was everywhere. She visited 21 states. She stayed until May, June 1918. So she didn't know at the time, but she stayed for that whole length of time. She filled the Dreamland Rink in San Francisco time and again, and that had a capacity of 8,000. Her entire speech was printed on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle. It was also in, I think it was the Butte Independent. I came across a full newspaper actually in the archive someone had sent my father, and her speech is on the front page, and the whole speech is in throughout the whole thing from Butte when she was here. So she really was quite a key figure in 1917 in Butte and in Montana. I think this does show that she was able to talk a lot about it. Here she is. This is the Butte Minor, and it's not a great copy, but it just says Distinguished Irish Lazy visiting Butte. Morris English apparently says he turned over the keys of hospitality to Hannah, so she visited all kinds of places, and that's something I'd like to explore a bit, is where did she go? I know she was taken down the Anaconda mine because it was still an underground mine. It's now abandoned, but it became open cast after 1917, so that was one of the I'd say she was really interested, because she's interested in the workers, and there had been a disaster not long before she came, and she was interested in the workers' conditions. It wasn't just a tourist thing, I'm certain about that. But that's evidence that she definitely came here to Montana. I'm not sure, as I say, about Missoula. So at the end, when she came back, but before she came back, she visited, she went to see President Woodrow Wilson. And this is why she has his quote on the front of this summary of her journey, which was published after she came back, and it quotes Woodrow Wilson, "We shall fight for the rights and liberties of small nations." That's published in 1919. She met with Wilson in early 1918, in March, and she had a petition from Cumann na mBan. She was the only Irish person at that time to meet with Wilson, so that was quite an achievement. And she said, you must recognise Ireland is a small nation. This is a war for small nations, and Ireland is one of them that deserves independence. And she kind of thought he was sort of semi-sympathetic, but of course Ireland did not get independence with the war, peace things. And so I think she's put that up a kind of in your face, President Wilson, you didn't actually do anything. I'm putting your quote on the front of this. I don't know, just interesting because that's published after the end of the war and Ireland still not independent. So just probably, this is the last slide or two, the reason I think that she decided to come home was she's speaking to Irish American audiences, but as I say, she's tapping into the workers and the social groups and the IWW, the Wobblies and that, and she's asked in San Francisco to speak on behalf of Tom Mooney. Tom Mooney was associated with the Wobblies. He wasn't a member, but he was a workers group. They were trying to get the 8-day week, and in San Francisco there was activism. And he was framed for a bomb that had gone off in San Francisco and been sentenced and thrown in prison. There was evidence that he wasn't even in San Francisco, so you know it was definitely an injustice. And his mother, who was Irish, actually came up to Hannah at one point when she was in San Francisco and said, "Can you do something?" So she's hosted there in the Civic Auditorium under the auspices of the Machinists Union and San Francisco Labour Group, and she's obviously well known enough to be an outspoken person in support of Tom Mooney. She'd spoken in the Dreamland Auditorium not about a week before, and then it was she went to book it again, or her supporters went to book it, and it was not available. And suddenly someone comes and arrests her in the Knights of Red Branch Hall. Police come and take her away, and there's a lot of opposition, and it's because she's speaking out against Britain, and Britain is our ally, and really we can't have this kind of speech going on. Now that's kind of odd because America was in the war since April the previous year, and people were saying that, but suddenly this came to a crescendo, and I think it's because the people who were booking the Dreamland Auditorium, or maybe ran it or owned it, the people who owned the newspapers were Irish of property. They didn't like people who supported Tom Mooney. And we were just discussing this the other day, that he was a little bit like the Birmingham Six. People believed he had committed this atrocity, even though he hadn't. He was innocent. And so, you know, the idea that she would speak on behalf of the Birmingham Six, or maybe Angela Davis, I don't know, trying to find an equivalent here, where people would believe, because it's a sensation. And I think that was a real turning point. She realized she was not getting access to places, and so she thought, well, maybe it's time for me to go home. Owen by then was in school in Santa Barbara, and she brought him home and back through New York. I learned that she also spoke again in Carnegie Hall. I didn't realize that. And she also spoke at Madison Square Garden, so there was a lot of quite big meetings, and there was a big send-off for her in San Francisco. But I think that was critical, and I'm going to explore that when I go to San Francisco and talk to people there and see whether we could tease out what exactly happened in the sequence of events and whether I'm right about that. But it seems odd, to say the least. So when she came back, the women had got the vote. It's 1918. We got the vote in, with Britain. They could stand for election. So Constance Markovitz, it was an election in October. Hannah joined Sinn Féin. That's a later date, but she joined Sinn Féin and she was offered a seat, but she was offered North Antrim. And she said, I don't know anybody in North Antrim. I've been away for 18 months. I'm not going to waste my time campaigning in a place that, I'll just not, it's not a winnable seat. And the thing is, the men were taking the winnable seats for themselves, aside from Markovitz. Sinn Féin executive had been set up also at that time, and the women were saying, we want representation on it. And the men were saying, well, we're going to have 6 male prisoners, and we're going to have 6 of this. And they said, yeah, we want 6 women. And they were ignored. And they wrote again and said, we want 6 women represented on your executive. And they were ignored. So they had to go and occupy the Sinn Féin offices in Harcourt Street, and they stayed there and said, we're not leaving until you give us representation. So that shows the reason why I think Hannah was marginalised was there was kind of opposition to strong women being represented in high places. She's there on the far left. By 1920 she must have replaced one of the women, because there are only 4 women, so they weren't granted to them. Kathleen Lynn there, Meg Connery, who you saw in some of the photos, and Jenny Wise-Power, and you'll recognise some of the boys in the front row as well, maybe more, if you like. So that's kind of, I think, the point I kind of want to make, is that what she did in the States was truly sensational. It was recognized by John Devoy. If you know him, he's not the most feminist and liberal of people, and yet he really recognized what she could do. She comes back to Ireland. She's remembered as a very strong feminist, the most prominent suffragette. I'd like to do this documentary because I want to have it remembered, and hopefully we'll have it brought out in 2018 to commemorate the vote. We've only got funding to get the footage with this film crew and get the documentary filmed. We now need to fundraise we're going to apply. There's a small film company that's going to apply for funds to get it produced, but we haven't got that far yet. Watch this space. But another space, just 2 slides and then I'm finished. That's where I won my case. This big forbidding building is my university, NUI Galway, it's called now, UCG, and I won a case against it for gender discrimination. I took the case in 2009. It took a long time to process. I finally learned I'd won in 2014. The reason I took the case was because I knew there was injustice. I knew I had to honor my grandparents and my parents even to take this. I had just taken early retirement when I won, so it was great. But before that, I just thought, well, I have to do it. Whether if I win or lose, I'm going to do it. And the reason I did was because I had applied 4 times for promotion. Now, it's kind of like tenure here. We get tenure early on, but then we have grades and promotion up. And this was from college lecturer to senior lecturer, not even professor. That's even higher up again. And I was told I was suitable twice, and yet not promoted, because not enough money to promote all 30 of us suitable. So I said to the registrar, how many women did you promote this time out of the 17? And he looked down through the list, and I still remember it kind of took a few seconds, and then he said 1. And I thought, well, that's not for wanting no candidates. I know I was deemed suitable the last time in 2007, so I then started to put together figures and take this case. I was advised to take it to the Equality Tribunal and put things together. But I discovered in that, and a lot of other things came out, but that the 16 men comprised 50% of the male candidates. The 1 female comprised 6.7% of the female candidates. So not even 7% of the female candidates was promoted. It's always useful to look at figures in different ways, because 1 to 16 is bad enough, but then when you see it that way. So there was much more than just about me, and that's the whole thing. And there are 5 other women who should have been promoted, who were shortlisted, deemed suitable, and the whole campaign has been as a result of that. And that's why there's an ongoing kind of battle in NUIG, because it says, you don't deserve it, you were judged by your peers. I know they met all the guidelines. A lot of the men promoted hadn't met the guidelines. 1 man hadn't a PhD, 1 wasn't even eligible to apply. I think us 6 women certainly deserved it, and I know, because I've seen everybody's application forms. So that's the campaign. If anybody has an interest, you learn more than you ever wanted to know about the campaign. Michelin's 3 conditions, you'll find out about that if you go online as well. But remember, it's THREE conditions that I laid on the university at wordpress.com, and I'm on Twitter as well. Might be worth it. There's a petition too if you want to support it. But the university question is still somewhat forgotten, put it that way. So I'll finish with this, just thanking the National Library, and that's the fundraising site where we raise money for the film crew, so that if you want to check it out, the background as to what I'm doing, if anybody feels like donating, it helps to have even $10 or whatever coming in. If you know anybody with money, we'd like very much to have this brought to fruition, and it'd be great. Please come to me or tell them to donate. So thanks very much for your patience and interest.
Any questions?
Or comments? Anybody can add anything to maybe the Butte Irish or the kinds of people? I'm kind of exploring a little bit the kinds of people who Hannah would have met in Butte and in Montana, where they all workers, where they're different cohorts of Irish people. Anybody got any comments on that even?
They were a mixture.
Mixture.
Jeremiah J. So you're members of the judiciary there. You had members of the police force. You're members of the Robert Emily Association, the Pierce Carpenter Club.
Yeah.
So you had those who were actually miners. You had those who were in management in the mining companies.
Management as well. Yeah.
Business people. So she was quite made a cross section because the Irish had basically, established themselves and all.
Yeah, that's the kind of, I was finding that in Chicago too, that they, there were working class Irish and people still working, but there was also the established Irish who came to these as well. So that's the same as indeed it is now everywhere. It was long ago that we were only working class and the lower classes. So, yeah.
So after you won your case in 2014, has the university promoted more women as a percentage, or is it still?
Pretty bad. For one, it hasn't promoted the 5 other women. Then they set up a task force to look into the whole thing, and the task force said you should start promoting, which was actually one of my conditions, that you start promoting women proportionate. So if you're 53% at the college lecturer level, then 53% of those, not even 53% of those promoted should be women. So in other words, half of those pretty well promoted should be women. They haven't done that yet. They did 30%. We wouldn't like to upset the men, and now 40. They said we'll have a new vice president for equality and diversity. So they've spent 106,000 euros per annum paying this new post, but they can't afford to promote the women. So there's a lot of window dressing and trying to publicity and things, and it's not that impressive what they've done, and they would need to promote a hell of a lot more. We're ranked well last in Ireland for the percent senior female staff. We're number 7 out of 7, and we're quite clear blue sea between us and UCC. We have 21% senior staff, 14% professors. So it's working. What's happening now is the Higher Education Authority has imposed, or at least said, that the funders should impose conditions on giving funds, and that's beginning to happen. That there's an award called the Athena Swan Award, and if you get the minimum bronze award, then you can unlock some of the funds. But if you don't get it, you won't get some of the funds. Now they're running around like headless chickens because they've failed to get the bronze award again. And they're bullying the 5 women. It's as if it was their fault. I could give you a talk about that because we've had a lot of fun as well, because they're kind of not, we had a cartoon exhibition thing, so you could check out the website. But there's intentions, and that's all the bronze award is for. But while they're still fighting 5 women in the High Court, I don't think they're going to get no bronze award, personally. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little more about pacifism in Ireland?
In Ireland, that's abroad.
From your grandfather's time to the present, how strong has this tradition been?
Well, it wouldn't be that strong. I mean, again, I'm not a historian, but there were very key pacifists. I mean, Bernard Shaw obviously was very similar to Frank and vegetarian and all that. Louis Bennett was a very strong pacifist, and there were people in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, like Louis Bennett and Hannah and those. And so there was a cohort always there, and they worked often with the socialists. But I'm not sure how, I'm not sure, because some of the times it's how much they're reported. Right. You hear, like here I'm hearing about Hannah speaking about Ireland, but I don't hear what she does with the socialist thing. So how much the pacifists were reported is a factor. But my gut feeling is they were very strong, but they were a cohort, a voice that were heard at the time and throughout. Even now there would be the humanist groups, and that would be strong in that. And of course there'd be anti-war groups, which would be international as well. Yeah.
How long did Hannah live, and then in your archival research, did you find anything where she comments on the drafting of the Constitution?
Oh yes, the actual Constitution, yeah. There's a biography of Hannah by Margaret Ward, which recounts actually, she kind of regrouped herself and her suffs, as she called them, her suffragette friends, came together to campaign against the Constitution, because it's bad enough as it is for women the way it is phrased, but they managed to get a few clauses taken out, including one referring to the inadequate strength of women. That was taken out. So she wasn't very impressed with it, and obviously compared to the relatively simple proclamation, and just the wording of it, it's just chalk and cheese, really. So she has written about it, and she's been quite scathing about it. And in that new book that Margaret Ward has put together, which is her writings, there are pieces on that. I haven't read it yet. I'm really sorry. I was supposed to bring it with me for every lecture, but I didn't. It's a big book. It's UCD Press, and it's called Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, Sinn Féiner and Suffragette. It's worth at least getting it for the library here. It's $60, I gather, here, so it's hardback so far. But yeah, it's worth having, and you'd get more out of it there, and I haven't read through it all yet. But for sure, she did comment on it.
Now, is Owen your father?
Yes. Yeah, Owen was my father. He was an only child, and actually, Frank, you could tell that he didn't, he appreciated his education, but he took Owen as an only child to a school, a small progressive school in Rathmines where they lived, and said, if he shows any signs of learning anything, I'll take him away immediately. Which obviously was not really the case, but it was more, I want him to be with friends and that. So he was an only child as well. Hannah nearly died in childbirth, so they didn't have more than one. But that's he's Owen, she's Kevin, and then I have 3 brothers, so there's only us in it. But yeah, and maybe you're going to ask, but people sometimes ask, did he ever talk about his time in the States? But unfortunately, he died when I was 16. And you know, when you're 16, I just remember one of the things I was saying to Treylock that I remember, which isn't that, wonderful. He gave up smoking age 7. So it was a progressive school where the boys were allowed, and I think it was just boys because it was called Boyland, which is interesting. It wasn't a mixed school. They were given a lot of freedom, and they did a lot of learning together as groups and project things, but obviously smoking somehow must have happened, and Owen must have decided no, he didn't like it. But there's little enough. My mother wrote a biography about him called Skeff, published by Lilliput Press, and she tells a few things, and one of the things she says is that when he first went to school, he was in Connecticut, in Stamford, Connecticut, probably staying with I'd like to know who he was staying with, actually, we never found that out, with an Irish-American family, and he enjoyed himself hopping from ice floe to ice floe in the frozen sea. This is in January, February 1917. So you wonder, we actually were on the shores of Connecticut and imagining how maybe in bays would have frozen over in that. Now, if Hannah heard that, I think it would be one reason why she thought maybe he'd be better off in San Francisco, in California. But he'd also had diphtheria, so she thought it was better for his health once she'd moved west that he should be there. And she, like me, was overwhelmed, or me, like her, with the size of here. She said, well, it's not a country I'm traveling, it's a continent. She went by train all over the place. There were many, many more train lines because she went to places now that and I've had to fly here from Chicago because I'm running out of time. But I've taken the train where I can because I think it's interesting to follow, around and see, well, okay, you're on the train. And as I say, I met a man on the train who was interested in history and gave me these documents. So you meet more people. And I'd like to kind of think, well, what was she? Well, she was on her own. She was Owen was in school, so she's traveling on her own. She's met by people, but what was that like? The loneliness of it. Was it peaceful? Was it and did she meet with people? I'm sure she did, and probably was active talking to them as well. So yeah, it's just an extra side of it. But Owen couldn't come with her all the time, obviously.
Could you go back one slide so I can?
Oh yeah, with pleasure. Oops. Yeah. So one of the 3 conditions, I might as well explain the 3 conditions. Jim Brown is the president of the university, and he kind of talked to me one of the early times, because I was outspoken about it. He said, we're setting up this task force, and are you interested in being on it? And I was kind of open to that. But then he lied to the press and said I was on it. And I said, no, I hadn't agreed to be on it. It was quite, he just wanted to get a sensational thing. So I said, well, if I'm going to be on it, I'm going to be on it on 3 conditions. One is you promote the 5 other women, which still hasn't happened. Secondly, you establish equality, because the last round of promotions, like we were talking, they only promoted a third of the women, and it was not, it was quite weird, that round. So promote all of those deemed suitable, and let's just get over it, because men and women were in tears that round as well. And then the third one was the cascade system of promoting, if you're 53% women, then you promote 53% women through the ranks. So they haven't implemented those conditions. I never sat on that task force. It was hand-picked. I wouldn't have enjoyed it too much. I didn't. It was very much trying to, just reinforce the thing. So that's the background to the conditions, and it just became the campaign. We also had these, I don't know if you've heard of the comedy show, the television series, Mrs. Brown's Boys. It's a comedy thing. It's where actually Brendan O'Carroll plays Mrs. Brown, so it's kind of slapstick. And anyway, our president is called Mr. Brown, so we had the T-shirts with Mr. Brown's Boys and all the cronies. They didn't like it at all, oddly enough. But it's good to, the publicity and also having a bit of fun and poking fun at them helps a bit, so you're not totally strident. And I think Hannah had a sense of humour. Hannah would tell jokes and like this is black humour in a way, but the British said that it was a good thing they took away Sheehy Skeffington, troublemaker. And then one of them said, and it's a pity we didn't get rid of the widow while we were at it. And she said, somewhere, yes, it would have saved everybody a lot of trouble if I would save me trouble as well if you had, so it's kind of, but that's it, she was causing a lot of trouble, so she makes a joke out of it. It's kind of interesting, it's useful. Yeah.
Have you spoken in Butte before?
Yeah, no, in 2001, and it was terrific. I mean, I really felt, as I say, it was a key place. I did a tour for another reason. I was trying to set up a women's study centre actually out of the family home, and that didn't happen, and I didn't fundraise in that tour, but I thought I'd repeat some of what Hannah did in 2001. And I wrote to Ellen Crane, who's the archivist there, and I was hosted there. But it was amazing because I met all kinds of people who, sadly, most of them have passed on now. I met the Yank Harrington, who was 99 at the time, musician. And the ladies AOH hosted me to a formal brunch. There was a man there called Skeffington Sheehy, who was named, it turns out he was thrilled to meet me, and the poor man, he was 92 when he died, I guess it's a long time since 2001. I said, how did you get called Skeff Sheehy, And I have a cousin who's an archivist who told me about Skeff Sheehy, and he said, well, he went to school in 1932 in the Christian Brothers, and it wasn't Butte, I'm not sure, somewhere outside Butte, and the priest there had just come from Ireland, and 1932, I think it's only 16 years, and he said, gosh, you're the first Sheehy I've met since, leaving Ireland. I'm going to call you Skeff Sheehy after Francis Sheehy Skeffington, who I admired very much. So it was quite moving, because then Skeff Sheehy kind of introduced me and told the whole story about my grandfather and that. But so it was quite a moving time for me as well in Butte. I felt kind of at home, and of course everybody there, as here, is Irish, you're talking Irish thanks to Trail. They're all called Sullivan and Harrington. I don't know about any of you called from Allihies. People emigrated from Allihies, where there was a copper mine. They were emigrated to Butte, among others. Yeah. Sullivan.
There's a Frank Sheehy right here. I understand the trouble in Butte.
Wow.
I went to school.
And on the border
Okay, it must have, yeah.
is Martha Sheehy, who was a daughter of Skeff Sheehy,
Martha Sheehy was a daughter. Oh, on the what?
on the border regions.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So, yeah, because Sheehy's obviously Sheehy is relatively common, but I've discovered some relatives in Nebraska and Iowa who are Galvins and Gettys, but their great-great-great-grandmother was Johanna Sheehy, who was the sister of my great-great-grandfather, who was the father of Eugene and David. And they actually have a book or something, where there's a piece written saying, Father Eugene Sheehy came here in 1881. And I said, that's proof that we are related. And I'd only met them for the first time when I came over. They came to Chicago. It was quite moving because they hadn't been to Ireland and they hadn't met anybody of the family from Ireland. So you never know, we could be related.
Thank you so much, Ms. Sinead. Talk that you just gave, and it's good to see that the fight goes on anyway to improve the law for young women and to make sure they're treated in a just and appropriate and proper manner. I also want to take this opportunity to thank everybody here for coming out. We have, of course, in the Del Brown room. We were going to put you on the LA 11 building down in the basement, then we were going to be on TV, so we said we better put our best get us into the Del Brown. So this is why we're here. Now, I would like to thank a number of people for helping to organise this. Of course, the Irish Studies programme and the Friends of Irish Studies. I know a lot of you down there are members of the Friends, and your contribution over the years has been unbelievable, enormous. And the reason why Irish Studies is as strong as it is, and even the current circumstances, I like to think that this is very appropriate, because when we talk about, you know, Skeff Sheehy and his daughter being on the Board of Regents, and hopefully, you know, having such friends as that and friends like you, we'll have a long future here in the University of Montana. But there are other people I'd like to thank specifically for all the work they do. Sometimes it goes unnoticed. Lisa Green, who's the assistant to the Irish Studies program, has been very instrumental in organising all kinds of things for Irish Studies. It's the reason why Irish Studies is now getting a reputation for efficiency. I'm no longer organising it. So things are getting done, you know. And as you know, we are being recorded here. We've been recorded, of course, for the documentary Back in Ireland. We're also doing a documentary of our own, Thomas Francis marriage, you know. And also we've been recorded by MCAT. And I would like to actually say very quickly that this presentation has been recorded by Missoula Community Access Television as part of a media assistance grant donated to Irish Studies by MCAT. So we'd like to thank MCAT for donating and giving a grant to enable us to record this talk tonight. And I know having a record of this talk will be very, very beneficial for our students and forthcoming students, and hopefully we'll get more and more speakers out there of the quality and of Micheline that we can record and share with our students. So just to conclude, thank you, Micheline, for taking the trouble to come out here. It's very, very, it's a great honour for us to have you here, and especially 100 years after your grandmother, who was such a great, a true heroine, like your grandfather. So it's great that you were here. We're honoured to have you, and also to thank all of you for coming out and showing your love for your history and your heritage and your culture, for all the support you've given us down through the years. But So squealing my lip, I let you go. Thank you all so very much. Thank you.